Hello, everyone. This is Arifin, and this presentation is regards to the higher distinction assignment for the unit interface design and development. Now I will begin. In this presentation, we're diving deep into Vue.js version 3's innovative and transformative feature, the Composition API. Since its release, Vue.js has become a favorite among developers due to its ease of use and simplicity. The advent of Vue version 3 has only amplified this popularity with a strong push towards increased scalability, maintainability, and flexibility in component logic management. Today, we will delve into the need for Composition API, its benefits over the API, and its role in making Vue.js a more powerful tool for developing web applications. The shift from Vue version 2 to Vue version 3, though smooth, was prompted by some key issues developers faced with the Options API. While initially well received, the Options API proved to be limiting the larger applications. It released in scattered logic, making it harder to trace related logic across various platforms. This presented challenges in terms of code maintainability and readability. Understanding these limitations and the growing demand for a more efficient logic handling solution, the Vue team introduced the Compositions API in Vue version 3. In this new API, it has quickly grasped an essential tool in the Vue developers toolkit, offering a more organized way of maintaining component logic. Now, let's talk about its background and rationale. The introduction of the Composition API wasn't just a random design decision by some Vue team. It was the result of careful deliberation on the growing pain points Vue developers were facing. In larger applications, the Options API often led to a lot of boilerplate code and a tendency for spaghetti code. Now, that's a term I always hear while writing code, but I try to improve it. This made it harder to work with and reason about related pieces of logic as they were often spread out in different lifecycle hooks or methods. Moreover, logic reuse across components was challenging and often involved creating mixins and higher order components. With the Composition API, these problems were significantly addressed and it brought about a function based ways of defining and organizing code within components. So what it did is um, it made it a lot more easier to follow logic, reuse code, and manage state. Now, reusing one of the main functionality of writing any code is to avoid duplication and use codes efficiently in the most efficient way possible. And with Composition API, which is used in V version 3, it had a significant aspect benefiting that logic. So that was one of the key points why developers saw the need of using Compositions API way more than Options API. Now, if we talk about the Composition API basics, firstly, I will have to say that it introduces a setup method, which is the new component option that Vue version 3 brings to the table. This setup method is where we can use reactive features and compose our components logic. Now, what is a reactive method and how does it function? I will talk about it in the further discussions. Now, we are past the basics. Now, let's consider some example. So, in this code, the setup function is defining a reactive value count and a function increment that updates count. These are then returned and then used in the components template. This setup is more organized and makes it easier to trace the component's logic as everything related to the count state is defined in one place. But the true power of the composition API becomes more evident when we start to abstract shared logic into reusable functions, what we call composables. We will delve deeper into this in the following sections. Now, well, let's talk about the power of computed properties and watchers. In the Compositions API, computed properties and watchers can be directly used inside the setup function. What it does, what it does is it provides a more intuitive way to manage state and respond to changes. Now, here's this term that comes managing state. So, state management is a big factor, and Vue.js does a tremendous job in managing state. So, what state management is, I could briefly say, is let's say you open a website and you try to book a ticket. So, when you'll try to book a ticket, how would the server know that you're not a spammer? You could just be a spammer and book a ticket and do something unethical. So to avoid that, the user must be logged in with an authentic information that can be stored in the database to cross check. And to implement that, we use something called state management. So, what state management does is it checks whether the user is logged in. And if the user is logged in, then it redirects that user uh, to that next page. If not logged in, then it will redirect the user to the login page, make sure the user logs in, and then only they can proceed to the next page. It could also be done in a different way that anyone could think of is basically maybe implementing on click function. If the user clicks on book tickets, it checks, it goes to the server, checks if the server responds to that user being like having its data or not. If not, then comes back and says, no, you're not logged in, and then redirects the user to the login page. Now, the problem with this thing is it's constantly bugging the server side and r- did like and this is not an efficient way. This is not an ideal way of writing code, and that is where Vue.js's this state management does a very tremendously and very efficient job. Now, back to the computed properties, these are especially powerful when dealing with derived state and watchers. They and these watchers allow us to perform side effects in response to reactive data changes. Now, let's talk about an example. Here's an example of how computed properties and watchers can be used. In this component, doubled count is a computed property that depends on count, and a watcher is used to log changes to count, which is exactly what is the most efficient way of calculating and computing this sort of function. Moving forward, let's talk about the reactivity in Composition API. One of the most powerful aspects of Vue.js is its reactivity system. And Vue 3's Composition API enhances its system even further. The Composition API gives developers more control over reactivity, providing two ways to define reactive data: ref and reactive. While both these functions allows us to define reactive data, they each come with different implications. Ref is used for primitive types and is automatically unwrapped by Vue, while on the other hand, reactive is used for objects and is not unwrapped. Understanding the differences between these two functions and when to use each is very crucial. Now, let's talk about the advanced reactivity with watch effects and watches. So, in Vue.js's composition API, it has introduced two important functions to handle reactivity: watch and watch effect. While both of these functions allow users to watch reactive sources and respond to changes, their use cases differ very significantly. Watch effect function, sorry, what this watch effect method, it automatically tracks all reactive dependencies and runs in the function whenever any of the dependencies change. It also runs immediately after it's declared, which means it will run once when all your component is created. This is useful when you want to run some, let's say, code whenever your reactive data changes and the extract order of execution is not crucial. On the other hand, watch requires explicit declaration of what to watch, and it provides both the new and old values of the watch source. However, unlike watch effect, watch doesn't run immediately but only when the watch source changes. This provides more granular control over reactivity and the preferred choice when you need to control exactly when your watcher runs or when you want to compare the old and the new values. Now, moving forward, let's talk about the performance gains and the compositions API. Performance optimizations are another crucial aspect of the composition API. When it comes to reactivity, Vue 3 provides us with proxies which are more performant and have less k-ins than the object. Define proper, define property. Mm, div- div- so, like in Vue 2, we used object.define property, and in Vue version 3, it provides us more performance and it has less caveats, which we did have in Vue version 3 in object.define proper. In large components, it's easier to track dependencies with the compositions API, which ensures Vue updates only what needs to be updated. By having a more granular control over reactivity, you can optimize components and avoid unnecessary re-renders. As I always said, developers do not prefer duplications, re-renders. These are very basic and significant, I would say, uh, errors that professional developers would like to avoid. Let's consider an example now. In Vue version 3, the full name computed property is dependent on the entire user object. So any change to the user object triggers the computed property to recalculate. In contrast, in Vue version 3 and the composition API, the computed property full name directly depends on user.firstname and user.lastname. It will only update if either of these properties changes. This nuisance control over dependencies results in more efficient updates and enhances the performance of Vue.js applications. Moving forward, let's talk about the use cases for Composition API. Now that we have established the basics, let's see what the Composition API can be leveraged in real world applications. Consider a large application with multiple components that need to fetch data from an API. With the Options API, you would have to repeat the fetching logic in each component, leading to code duplication and maintenance problems. With the Composition API, you can abstract this logic into a composable function and reuse it across different platforms and components. In this above example, usePost is a composable that fetches posts from an API when the component is mounted. This logic can be used across multiple components and platforms, which was not the case previously. Now let's talk about testing components with Compositions API. Testing is actually an essential aspect of software development, and V version 3's Composition API brings in new opportunities to write more testable code. In Composition API, it enables us to extract logic into separate functions, making it easier to test pieces of logic independently from a component, which is way easier than what we did previously, where um, everything had a dependency and we had to test everything all together, otherwise, you can't test it at all. Consider a scenario where you need to fetch user data from an API and display it. In Vue.js version 2 options API, we would typically have this data fetching logic within a lifecycle hook, such as created or mounted. However, with the compositions API, we can easily extract this data fetching logic into its own use user composable function. So this is way easier than what we did in the past. This separation actually allows us to easily mock the get user function and test the logic in real world independently. As a result, testing becomes more straightforward and less tied to the Vue.js ecosystem, and making our tests cleaner and more reliable. The use of slots in Vue.js version 3. Slots in Vue are a powerful tool for creating reusable components. However, the Composition API takes this concept even further, allowing us to create slot based reusable functions that can transform our way of writing components. This new perspective enhances the possibilities of code and reusability, scaling, and maintenance. To understand how slots work with the Composition API, let's start by creating a simple base button component using the Options API, which is just right here. And then let's look into the equivalent Compositions API implementation in Vue version 3, where we use the Compositions API. As we can see, the setup function gives us access to a context object, which contains the slots. Then we use a render function to return a button with the default slot. This way, you have more control over the rendering of your components. Also, by using the Composition API's reactivity, you can dynamically update your slots according to your application state, leading to a more expressive and robust component design. Now, let's talk about the code organization and scalability in Composition API. The Composition API improves code organization and scalability significantly by abstracting related logic into composable functions. These functions can be used across components, which aids in reducing code duplication and enhances maintainability. Consider an application where multiple components need access to a user. In this example, use user is a reusable composable that fetches user data when a component is mounted. This function can be imported and used in any component that needs user data, keeping our code dry. Dry is don't repeat yourself, which I mentioned before, that duplication is something that every developer would try to avoid. And this whole method really improves the code organization. Now let's talk about the pitfalls and best practices. Despite the benefits, the Composition API is not without its pitfalls. Destructing a reactive object, for instance, can lead to loss of reactivity. When it comes to best practices, always prefix composable functions with use to make them easily identifiable. For instance, use pods, use user, and so on. Moreover, while the composition API provides more flexibility, it doesn't mean the options API is obsolete. The use the composition API when it makes sense, especially in larger applications or when you need to reuse logic. Now let's talk about components lifecycle hooks in composition API. In Vue version 3, components lifecycle hooks are exposed as functions that can be imported and used in the setup function, allowing you to organize your code in a more efficient manner. In the composition API, lifecycle hooks such as onMounted and on unmounted are available. These onMounted hook is called after the component is mounted, and the on unmounted hook is called after the component is unmounted. This way of handling lifecycle hooks allow you to group relate logic together rather than having them scattered across different lifecycle hooks. This makes the code easier to read and maintain, especially in larger components with complex logic. The ability to import and use lifecycle hooks like this also opens up new possibilities for code reuse. You can create custom hooks that encapsulate specific behavior with lifecycle hooks and reuse them across different platforms. This can result in cleaner and more efficient code that is easier to read and maintain. Now, finally, the composition API is indeed a game changer. For Vue.js, it enhances code organization, making complex components more manageable. However, like any powerful tool, it comes with its learning curve. Understanding JavaScript closures, the nuisance of reactivity in Vue, and the pitfalls to avoid are all crucial parts of mastering this API. But with understanding, you can write Vue applications that are scalable, maintainable, and a joy to work with. Thank you very much for following me in this deep dive into composition API. Remember, the key to mastering it, like any other coding concept, is practice. So keep building, keep exploring, and keep learning. Thank you very much for being with me all throughout this presentation.